Great. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody today on this Tuesday afternoon, evening, to our virtual demonstration with Martha Grover. We are so pleased that she has agreed to do this and that we get to spend the evening in the studio with her. Her talk is entitled "Thrown and Altered Porcelain." And she's going to show you a lot of beautiful things today. And be sure to check out Martha's work in the online shop at clayartcenter.org/shop. Before I hand things over to Martha, though, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about Clay Art Center to those of you who are new and joining us for the first time. So Clay Art Center is located in Port Chester, New York, which is about 20 miles north of New York City, and we're in Westchester County. We're a recognized, nationally recognized nonprofit ceramic arts organization, and we offer studio rental, education for all levels, artist in residence programs, exhibitions, a shop, as well as a robust community arts program. And now a little bit about our artist. So is a fountain potter, creating thrown and altered porcelain pieces. She attended Bennington College in Vermont, where she received her undergraduate degree in architecture, and she received her MFA in ceramics from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I wanted to read her artist statement. It says, "I seek to enhance the experience of interacting with functional objects. I work toward creating a sense of elegance for the user while in contact with each porcelain piece. Reminiscent of orchids, flowing dresses, and the body, the work has a sense of familiarity and preciousness." So I'm going to hand things over to Martha, and I will see you guys at the end. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to my studio. I'm here in Maine and going to make one of these vases for you today. And it's been a real pleasure working with the Clay Art Center. Thank you so much for having me, and for everybody for coming to this workshop. I'm really excited. In the spring I have a solo show coming up, which hopefully will be able to happen in person at that point, and we're talking about doing an in-person workshop as well to go along with that. So look for that coming up in spring 2021. Pending pandemic. So the piece that I'm going to make for you today will be a vase very similar to this. I'm going to start out by throwing two pieces, the bottom and the top, and you can kind of see the seam line where they join. It will involve a few darts, some altering and added on bottom, kind of lots of different fun things to play with. I find these vases to be a really great way. Though I can throw something that's this tall, I find that when I make larger pieces like this, it's more time consuming to try to get the porcelain as thin as I would like. And I always really enjoy when you connect two parts together. It seems like a great opportunity to make some kind of a statement or a place where the glaze will break and pool. And so by throwing this in two parts, it's physically easier. The top part's only 1 pound, the bottom's 2.5 pounds, so very manageable amounts of clay. And I can get great height and kind of interesting moments within the piece by doing it in two parts. So without further ado, my husband Josh is here. He can come over into the oh, he's got power cords attaching him. So this is your cameraman, and if you guys have questions along the way, Josh is the one who's going to read them to me. So just so you have a face to go with the man behind the camera. So we're going to make our way over to my wheel.
There was a question about a recording available, and I imagine that the Clay Art Center has something that they will organize with that.
Or this may be a one-time only thing. I'm not sure. I'm not the administrator. I'm just the maker. So today I'm going to throw on bats, and I use one of these Wonder Bat adapter systems. So I'm just using little 6-inch bats. The clay that I'm using today, this is Archie Bray Foundation Graulig porcelain. So it's a cone 10 porcelain body. I fire up to cone 10, 11 oxidation. So I'm actually doing it in an electric kiln. For the bottom, as I said before, I'm going to use about 2.5 pounds of clay, and the top is just a pound of clay. So those are my ratios. I always throw the bottom first and then make the top to match. Rather than trying to go top down, I start bottom up. So I'm just going to start out, and as we always have to do when throwing, I'm going to get my clay centered. And I did wedge this clay, even though it's fresh out of the bag and theoretically doesn't have any air bubbles, although I may have wedged some in, as you do, you know. But I find the wedging really wakes the porcelain up. When I get it first out of the bag, it feels incredibly stiff. And then just by pounding it down on the table a little bit and starting to work it, the clay loosens up a whole bunch, which we will see later on as I do some hand building. It's a really wonderful property of porcelain that at points can be really, really frustrating. When I'm throwing something larger that's maybe 4 to 8 pounds, I find that it gets to a point when I'm pulling where the clay sort of loses all of its strength and it's just gotten really soft and floppy. And I find that I actually have to stop and kind of let the clay go back to sleep. We always talk about letting your clay wake up. Well, you can do the opposite as well, whereas if you need stiffness, you can get it not only through letting something dry, but also just letting it rest for a little bit. So that's what I do with larger pieces. But again, this is only 2.5 pounds, so it's not that big. So when I opened, I actually went all the way down to the bat. So I'm throwing bottomless, and I'm going to start out and make kind of a nice tall, simple cylinder, and then start to get some volume by bellying it out. But I find to get the maximum amount of height possible, it's better for me to start out and just make a very simple cylinder rather than trying to throw around my curves initially. So we're just going to go up. I'm going to keep the foot on this fairly narrow. The addition of the slab on the bottom allows me to end up having the bottom of the piece be more like a triangle than a circle, which I really love. And I can also get this great play between where I've altered and the slab that I add onto the bottom. But by adding the slab on, it does make the bottom circumference grow a little bit. So I do try to make often the bottoms of my pieces a little bit narrower than you might expect to begin with, because I know that they're going to get wider through the process. I am, however, leaving a little skirt of clay down at the bottom. Since this is bottomless, it means that there's very, very little surface connection between the clay and the bat. And so if I totally got rid of that little skirt at the bottom, this piece would just completely collapse and detach from the bat. So that seems pretty good. It feels fairly uniform top to bottom. I've maybe still got a little bit of clay down here. I could do just one more little tiny pull. And then I'm going to start to belly out the top. So start to give this a little bit of volume, kind of establishing a bit of a shoulder. Now on this piece, as you saw on the finished part, I'm actually going to take some darts right at the top rim of this. So it's okay if it's a little bit wide, because the darts are actually going to cinch that area in and make kind of a lovely waistline on the finished piece. So next, since I know I want to hand build on this, and for me, I feel like throwing lines are totally an aesthetic choice, and I prefer to have a really smooth surface for my glazes to melt over. So knowing that I want to alter, I want to get rid of as much moisture as possible at this point so that the piece will be stiff enough to alter sooner. And I want to get rid of the throwing line, so I'm going to rib. And I've got a long skinny metal rib that I'm going to use on the outside and a small rubber rib that I'm going to use on the inside.
Can you hold those up in front of me?
Sure. And these are both mud tools. They're both from Michael Sherrill. The yellow is kind of the medium soft, although I find it fairly firm, but it's definitely not as firm as the green and the blue, nor as soft as the red. But I really like this small shape, especially for getting insides of mugs and things. And I know that often when I'm teaching hands-on workshops, the practice of ribbing on the inside and the outside at the same time can be a little bit daunting to begin with, but what I do so that I can kind of know where my hand is on the inside, I hold my rib like this so that my index finger is actually making contact with the clay so that I'm not just flying by the seat of my pants. I can actually tell where my hand is inside of the pot and consequently where the rib is on the inside of the pot. So that helps me to have a little bit more control on the interior. Also, this little hole in the center is quite nice because you can put your thumb into that so that you've got a nice secure grip on the on the rib as you're doing your ribbing so that it doesn't inadvertently get stuck on the inside of the piece. So I'm starting right down at the bottom and then kind of working my way up. And unfortunately, I'm right-handed and you guys are on the left side of the wheel, so you probably don't have a great view of what's going on, but I'm scraping off all of this slurry so that it's smoothing, it's getting rid of the throwing lines, but it's also removing all that moisture. Another thing that it's doing is compressing the surface of the clay really, really well, so that when I go to stretch it as I alter, I'm not going to end up with a whole bunch of stretch marks because it's like I'm establishing a tight skin on the surface through doing this ribbing process. I think that looks pretty good. So once I'm happy with the shape, now it's finally time to get rid of this extra bit of clay at the bottom. As I said, that was sort of my safety net to make sure that the piece didn't detach as I was pulling up and throwing. So I always have to be really careful to wait and do this step right at the end. And then we'll cut that clay off and set it off to the side. Now, when I make these vases, I don't usually do any measuring to get the two pieces to fit. For one thing, I've made this piece a couple hundred times, so I'm pretty used to what size I need to make the top to fit on the bottom. But also with those darts that I'm going to take right at the top, it's going to cinch this in, probably between 1/2 inch to 1 inch, depending on how big I make them. So it really gives me a lot of wiggle room for fit between the two pieces. So we've got the bottom. I'm going to switch out bats and grab my 1 pound section of clay. So this will become the top. And for this piece, I am going to throw kind of an hourglass form. So once again, I'll get centered, make sure everything feels all nice and even. But I'm centering a little bit wide because this piece needs to be wide at the bottom, come in, and then get wider as it goes back out towards the top. Once again, I'm opening all the way down to the bat. It's kind of a nice luxury to have that you can just push until you feel your finger hit the bat instead of worrying about how much clay you're leaving down there. And then as I open out, I've got my right hand with the sponge kind of pushing down to make sure that this donut of clay is staying well adhered to the bat. And I'll actually keep a little bit of downward pressure as I make my first pull. And it kind of makes sure that the clay stays on center all the way up to the rim as you're starting to pull. Gives you a little bit of tension as you're pulling up. And again, kind of keeps the clay really nice and compressed. Now this piece only being 1 pound, it's going to be fairly small and fairly quick. So that was pull number 2, and I should be done by pull number 3. I find that this clay body and most porcelains in general, you kind of have a limited window of working because they are a fairly thirsty clay. They take on water really well. So now I'm kind of thinking about the relationship of the width of the rim of the pot in comparison to this other, the bottom piece that we threw, and kind of the width of the shoulder in relation to the width of the rim and how those two work together. And that looks pretty good to me. I think the waist could come in just a little tiny bit. So as I rib, I'm going to concentrate on kind of pushing in on this area. So I'm going to use the same 2 ribs again, but instead of using the flat side of the metal rib, I'll use the curved side to kind of get into this area right at that waistline. So starting at the bottom. And the great thing about this long metal rib is I didn't have to actually move it at all. I just moved my hand on the inside and kind of pushed the clay out into the rib. And so I can keep that hand really stationary and stable, which acts as a support. as well as ribbing the surface as I go from the bottom to the top.
There was a question about, is that piece going to be turned upside down when it's attached?
No, both pieces are actually right side up, which is kind of nice. It's an easy visualization between the two. Josh is handing me the finished piece that I have here. So I'm trying to make sure I'm in frame. So this bottom right here is the bottom of the piece on the wheel. So everything's going to stay right side up as it gets stacked up. So that, I think, looks pretty good. Now, if you decide you want to try to make one of these stacked vases and you do want a little bit of an idea of a measurement, you can take your calipers and get yourself an exterior measurement once you rib, or once you cut off this extra little skirt of clay. Because I'm probably going to take off a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. Something more like 5/8, or, well, that would be more than a half. It's not quite a 1/2 inch, but quite a bit. And I'll round up that corner. So then I can take my calipers and measure on the exterior of this and see what size that is. And then if we set this out of the way and get the first one we threw back. And then if I measure across the top, look at that, they're exactly the same size. I think I've done this before. So make them about the same size, because what's going to happen when I cut my fancy pattern at the bottom of this, I'll be cutting up a little bit. And as you can see, I'm going up the slope into that waistline. And so the circumference is going to get narrower. And this one's going to get the darts. But if we stack them up, and Josh pulls back just a little bit, you can kind of see how the vase is going to come together. So then for me in my process, there's always a lot of letting things wait and stiffen up a little bit, because that clay is incredibly soft. And if I tried to alter it right now, there'd be a great likelihood that I would end up collapsing something. So lucky for you guys, I threw some pieces earlier this morning, let them sit out just the right amount of time so that they're ready to alter right now. So we're gonna come over to my big table. I'm gonna wash off my hands. And we'll talk a little bit about altering. So I have a bottom, one of those big bulbous forms. And this has stiffened up to the point where if I touch the surface, it's not tacky anymore. I'm not getting any sort of fingerprints, but it is soft enough that I can wiggle the rim and have things move a little bit. So it's still got some flexibility, but it is firm enough that when I go to push my fingers through it, it's not going to fall down on me. Now, I often alter things in thirds, so I have marked my bat in thirds, which you probably can't quite see, but there is a little line that I put on with a marker. It seems like I have to go back in and re-mark them every year or two because they get worn off through the throwing process. You can see exactly how wide I end up throwing on this bat. So I've got a finger, my index finger, and a sponge. And I've gotten my finger just a little bit damp. And then I'm going to use this and press in from the outside. And this is going to end up making this little indentation line that you can see here. So I'll support the piece with my non-dominant hand. And I'm right-handed, so I'm taking my right index finger, starting at the bottom, pushing in, and coming right up to that shoulder and then gently sliding out. We're going to do that 3 times. So starting at the bottom, pushing in, and coming right up to the shoulder and out. Now, one thing, I have not cut this off of the bat. It is still attached to the bat, which is nice because it gives you kind of a third hand holding the piece down onto the table. So the piece isn't going to try to walk up and follow you. Also, as I'm pushing in at the bottom, it's stuck down so that I'm not distorting the bottom of the piece. I will make this into more of a triangle when I cut it off and flip it over. But I didn't want it to do that as I was trying to make those altering lines. So after I alter, now I'll cut it off of the bat and flip it over. And I was able to cut off the little skirt on the outside, but not on the inside. So there's this sort of little shelf right there. And we won't worry about that. Most of it's going to get cut off as I make my feet anyways. But we'll make that into a triangle. Then the top has stiffened up quite a bit because air can get onto both sides. However, the bottom, being close to the bat, air could really kind of only get to this exterior part, and it's still quite soft. So this piece I would let sit upside down for maybe another half an hour or so before it was ready to work on. And I'm going to set it out of the way somewhere that I'm not going to bounce the table too much. Actually, Josh, can you hand me a plastic bat? One of those little guys. That'll work too. So I'm going to set this onto a plastic bat. The plastic is going to make sure that the rim doesn't get too stiff. If I put it onto a wooden bat or a piece of drywall or a piece, I was about to put it up onto my shelf, which is made of plywood, anything like that is slightly absorbent, and so it's going to pull moisture out of your rim, and then when you go to alter, it would have a tendency to want to crack. So we're sort of protecting the rim. It's almost like wrapping the rim by putting it onto a plastic bat. So the next thing, I need a slab. I tend to make a really big slab and then use it throughout multiple pieces rather than making lots and lots of little tiny slabs. So I've got about 5 pounds of clay here. And my first step, I wedged it to make sure that it was nice and homogeneous. I've been finding recently with my blocks of clay that whatever it is towards the outside of the box tends to be really stiff. And when I go to stretch to make a slab, I find that that side doesn't stretch quite as much, and so I end up with an uneven slab. So I find it better to do a little bit of wedging, and then everything is much more uniform. So when I go to stretch, hopefully our slab will stretch out evenly. So step one, I'm going to take a mallet and pound this out until it's a little bit less than an inch thick. And usually I pound on one side and pound on the other. And usually right about this point, someone asks, what's your table surface made of? So this is just a piece of plywood. I actually used it for a show that I did at the Bray. It looked like a big dining room table. It was kind of this faux pedestal table hybrid. And so I stained it with a mahogany stain and then varnished it with a satin varnish. And then when we moved back to Maine and built the studio, I said, oh, I've got that piece of beautiful birch plywood that'll make a great table to work on in the studio. So that's why it's a funny color. So my next step is to start to stretch this chunk of clay. And what I'm doing is taking the clay and tossing it, but I'm tossing it towards myself. A few things to think about as you're making a slab this way. An object in motion wants to stay in motion. So by tossing it towards me, the front edge catches, and then the momentum of the weight of the clay pulls it and stretches it. Often in workshops, I find that people, rather than tossing, take their slab and pound it down on the table. And that makes a really loud noise, which is a key thing to note, that you're not doing it right. It should make kind of a whop sound instead of a smack sound. And by slamming it down straight, what's happening is very similar to a drop of water falling into a pool. So the water hits in the middle and then stretches in all directions in those beautiful, lovely circles. What that means is that the middle is not stretching at all, and the outside is stretching a lot. So you end up with a slab that is very, very thick in the middle and thin on the outside. We don't want that. So we're going to toss with a motion. So I'll go a little bit in one direction and rotate and go in the other. Now, I really like making slabs this way. One, you don't have to have a big expensive piece of equipment, no slab roller necessary. Two, you can do it anywhere because no slab roller necessary. But most importantly, this makes a slab that is really, really well compressed and consequently stays where I put it. So it's less likely to warp and try to crack away from the thrown piece. So then once it gets to the appropriate thickness, which is just a little bit thinner than my thrown, or thicker than my thrown parts, I'm going to move on to a piece of drywall. And at this point, I will actually come in with a rolling pin. Now, you probably can't see in the video, but where I grabbed onto the clay is just a little bit thinner. And so I'll use the rolling pin to even everybody out and make sure that it's nice and uniform. Now, one pass of the rolling pin sticks it down to the piece of drywall, so I just gently lift it before I go in for the second pass. I don't use any thickness strips or anything like that. I've made an awful lot of these slabs, so I'm pretty good at making them uniform, but we're actually going to stretch it again. So don't worry if you go to make a slab like this and you find you need it to be a little bit thinner. We can rectify that later. Last step, I want this slab to have a really nice tight skin on it, and again, be very, very well compressed. So I'm going to take my water sprayer and gently mist the top, very, very little water, but enough that my rib is going to glide over the surface. Now, when I come in with a rib, I've got my fingers spread out so that I've got uniform pressure throughout, so I'm not making lines and troughs and furrows into my slab. And I go over it at least twice, usually 3 times, in varying directions to compress and again to make that tight, tight skin on the slab. And then to flip it over, I want to do the same thing on the other side. I take a second piece of drywall, sandwich, flip, and then gravity takes care of the hard work and gets the slab off of the first piece of drywall. And then repeat, spray a little water, take a clean rib, and compress, compress, compress. Now, I am fortunate enough to have my dog at the studio with me every day. And our beautiful Maggie dog has these great little black hairs. And there are 2 of them in the middle of this slab. I have to admit, there have definitely been times where I've had finished work, well, ready to be bisque work on the shelf, and there's been a Maggie hair in it, and I think, oh gosh, why did the piece crack there? And upon closer inspection, I discover it's just a little black Maggie hair, unfortunately. So, well, fortunately, because it wasn't a crack. So my very last step, I am going to cut off this exterior edge. Because no matter how good you are at making slabs this way, that little edge on the outside is always just a little bit thinner and is going to want to dry faster than the rest of the slab. Now, experience tells me that this makes a nice slab that stays where you put it and is less likely to crack. When we lived in Montana, the humidity in the studio was incredibly low. Often it was anywhere between 10 and 20%. Whereas here in Maine, I think we're running about 95 right now percent humidity. It's a little damp. But every now and then I'd be working in the studio late and I would have made one of these slabs and tucked it off onto a high shelf and kind of forgotten about it for a while. And come in the next day and found that it was bone dry and completely flat, had not moved at all. So that tells me that this technique for making slabs yields a slab that will stay flat and doesn't want to crack. It's kind of a hard lesson to learn, but it proved to me that this is a good way to make a slab. So again, lucky for you guys, I threw 2 pieces this morning, and I altered this one probably, I guess, about an hour and a half ago or so, and then let it sit out for about a half an hour. So now the bottom has caught up with the top, where it no longer, I'm not making any fingerprints. It has a little bit of rigidity to it. It is on the softer side, so I can alter the shape that way. But when I go to press down to attach my bottom, the whole thing isn't going to collapse, which is quite nice. So first step, we're going to add this little guy. That little number on the bottom, this piece is available in my web shop. So that's my inventory number. And I didn't want to lose track of it, so I stuck it to the bottom. I think he's going to have to take a bath, though, before he goes back on the shelf, because he's gotten covered with clay. But that's the great thing about ceramics, right?
How thick is the throne wall?
So let me grab a ruler, because I don't know. Now, inherently, even though I'm an okay thrower, my bottoms are always a little bit thicker than my top. So this is exactly 1/4 of an inch at the bottom, if you guys can see. 1/4 of an inch. But the top is now very deformed. The top is probably an 1/8 smaller than that. So it's just about an 1/8 of an inch. So I do lose an 1/8 between the bottom and the top. Ideally, they would be exactly the same consistency. On mugs and smaller pieces like that, I'm pretty sure they are, but in a bigger piece, I have a little weight at the bottom too. All right, so the first step for me on a piece like this is to decide where I want my feet. I tend to make pieces that always rise up off of the table a little bit and kind of feel like they're dancing. And for me, it makes a lot of sense to put the foot right at the bottom of that indentation that we made. And then where the piece kind of bellies out, have the bottom rise up away from that. Rather than just randomly picking a place for a foot, it seems to make sense to me that everything, each choice along the way kind of drives off of that initial decision to make this indentation here. So I know I want to make 3 feet. So I'm just taking the back of my knife and giving myself a little mark right in the middle of where the foot will be. And then I'm going to come on either side and do another little mark and end up making the foot anywhere from 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch wide. So it's not standing up on point shoes. It does have stability to it because of course somebody's going to put flowers inside of this vase, which can make it a little top heavy. So we want to make sure that it is making enough contact with the table. Then as I go to cut away, I am holding my knife at an angle. So I'm not just making a horizontal cut straight through. My knife is tilted. And the angle that I'm cutting at, the blade is higher than my hand. So I'm kind of going at this sort of a diagonal. And what that does, it establishes the curve that the slab is going to take as it comes over this edge. So again, I'm not getting a hard corner. It'll feel very organic and like a plant grew it, hopefully. But it's also making this really thin paper edge on the inside that'll make a really nice seam on the interior. So again, I'm not ending up with a right angle joint. I'm ending up with kind of an obtuse angle. It's a little bit bigger and makes it less of a corner on the inside. But it's also creating a little bit of an optical illusion because if we put this ruler across on the outside of the cut, it comes quite a bit further down. But right on the inside, it's actually not raising up that high, which means that where the feet are, I'm not ending up with this huge deep well that's going to be really hard to clean when you get flour goop in there. Or if this were a coffee cup, you know, where your coffee settles, or if you end up with a tea stain. So then I also made a slab earlier in the day because your slabs need to set up just like the pots set up. Ideally, everything ends up being the same consistency. This piece doesn't have handles, but if it did, I would make sure that the thrown parts, the slabs, and the handles were all at the same consistency when I go to attach them. As things dry, they shrink. And so if one piece has dried more than the rest, it means that it shrunk more than the rest. And then as the rest of the parts start to dry, you're going to end up cracking. And I think often folks are a little bit afraid of porcelain because it does have a reputation that it cracks a lot. And a lot of that comes from not ending up with parts that are in the same stage as you are attaching them together. So I've got my slab here. It's a little bit thicker than 1/4 inch, so it's a little bit thicker than my pot, but it feels quite stiff right now. So what I'm going to do to wake it up is I'm going to slam it down on the table a few times. And just like I was talking about with throwing, that motion all of a sudden gives us all of this extra flexibility without having to add any water to the clay. So I'm not changing the dryness level, but I'm changing the suppleness. I'm changing the flexibility of the clay. And just like everything, stretch marks are inevitable. So I'll go back and rivet one more time. For those of you that have experienced my pots before, the bottoms are really, really smooth. They feel like polished marble. And most of that smoothness comes from ribbing this slab right now. I don't do that much sanding. I do a little tiny bit when it comes out of the final glaze kiln, but almost all of it comes from this process right here. So the piece of slab that I've cut is at least 1/2 inch too big all the way around. Where did I put that sponge?
Oh, I got it.
Losing tools. So Josh is going to grab my sponge for me. I always keep a damp sponge close by, and before I go to use my rib, I always make sure that it's really clean, and that little bit of moisture also helps it glide across the surface. So then I'm going to take the rib and push these two pieces together. And what this does, you can see that it's starting to shape it into the curves of the bottom of the pot, but it's also giving me this great impression of the bottom of the piece. So now I know where to slip and score without actually flipping the piece over and having to make that line. We're doing pretty good on time. I was told to try to keep this just about exactly an hour. So, and we're just at the half-hour mark, so we're doing great.
What did you just do?
So I have this wonderful joining slip. If you are interested in making some kind of a joining slip, if you've had trouble with things cracking, I've been using this stuff probably since about 2002, 2003. It's been quite a while. And I find it makes really, really strong attachments. For those of you that have seen my DVD, there's a section of it where I talk about making this slip. And lucky for you, Ceramic Arts Daily, or now they're called the Ceramic Artists Network, has made that section of the video available on YouTube for free. And I have it on my website. So if you go to marthagrover.com and go to the In Process page, it's one of the videos that's at the bottom of the In Process page. And you can learn all about making this joining slip. And you can use it with any clay. You just make it with whatever clay body you're using. So what I just did, I scored. First I slipped, then I scored, and I'm using this little Kemper scratch wire brush. It's about the same width as my work, so I find it's a good scale for my pieces. And I did the same thing on the slab, applied the slip, and then scored back through it. And then I'm going to put the two pieces back together. And I'm just making sure that everything lines up along the way. Then I'm going to take my handy dandy rib once again, and I'm putting pressure on this, but I'm being sure to just push down right over the wall. So I'm not pushing in this middle area, so I'm not collapsing that in, but I'm making sure that these two pieces are very, very well attached between the two. Now, no matter how many times I've done this, the seam on the inside to start out with always is kind of a train wreck. As well as on the exterior, there's always a little bit of extra joining slip kind of oozing out and some extra scoring marks. So I've got a long-handled, kind of medium, soft, stiff brush. And I'll just get it a little wet and then kind of wring it out on my sponge. And I'll take this and go around both the outside and the inside. And I'm erasing any extra scoring marks, as well as picking up any extra slip that may have oozed out of the seam. And then that kind of thin edge that we talked about as we cut the foot comes into play right now. So that thin edge, by just running my brush across it, makes that seam on the inside disappear, which is pretty exciting. So just like that, 2 or 3 times around, and our seam is gone. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to actually cut this slab. I feel like if I cut the slab to shape, pull it off to the side, slip and score, try to line it back up, I can never get it to be in exactly the right spot, and I always have to go back and cut it again. So I find it much more useful to attach first and cut second. Now I'm going to cut a series of points and curves kind of running around the outside of this. So I've just gone along and I've put a little tiny dot in front of each one of my indents. And that's my little indicator dot of where the tip of the point is going to be. So from this point, I'm going to come back in towards the piece and then curve out and back in, and so on and so forth all the way around. But when I go to cut, I'm going to utilize the banding wheel. And I'm going to use that to draw the slab through my knife. So my hand is actually staying in one place, and I'm just rotating the knife blade to determine if I'm coming in or coming out. But my arm is really, really stable. So that makes it easy to cut kind of this very intentional line without it having too many wavers in it. And so that's the shape that I made. They sort of look like, for all you math nerds like me out there, they look like brackets in an equation, kind of running all the way around the pot. So then this edge looks very orthogonal. It's got a real right angle to it at the top and the bottom. And I really want my work to feel much more organic. So I'm going to take a damp sponge. So I just got my sponge wet and then wrung it out so there's no water dripping out of it. And I'll take that and add a tiny bit of moisture to this edge. Not a ton, just a little bit, so that I can take my index finger and thumb, kind of holding them like this, and run them around the piece and knock off those two corners, kind of rounding them up a little bit. Because I want this to feel much more like a petal on a flower than something that was cut with a knife. And I kind of go back and forth between the sponge, which does have a little tooth to it, so it can kind of remove that corner a little bit, and then also squeezing with my index finger and thumb. Now this squeezing motion, once again, wakes up the clay even more. And of course, that little tiny bit of moisture that's getting applied does as well, so that I can take this and kind of fold it up around the piece. So it's really nice and soft and subtle at this point, supple at this point. So now I'm taking the rib and starting above the wall and working my way down. I'm constricting the slab in. So very similar to when you throw and collar something in, you can't just squeeze it all in all at once, or you'll get a buckle, you'll get a fold. The same thing happens with the slab. So I go in a little bit at a time, and I can kind of constrict this and not end up with the slab folding in on itself at all. Now, once I get it most of the way in, I'll move to my finger, because this kind of goes in right there at the foot, and I can't get my rib in there. So my finger's kind of going along the edge and making sure that the slab is sealed in. But I haven't pushed down right here because I'm going to make this. So I'm going to make kind of another little petal right at the bottom. So at this point, I'll flip this right side up, and we won't flip it over again. So then right in the center, I'm going to take one finger, pull that out just a little tiny bit. And then this motion is very similar to pulling a spout on a pitcher. And I think that kind of in my journey through clay, I was totally enamored with pitchers for a couple years. And I just wanted to put spouts on everything. And I think that's kind of how these edges started to grow. Also, all of the source material that I was looking at, flowers and dresses and ruffles and ridges. And so I wanted to have that incorporated into the piece, as well as being able to make that edge of a spout over and over and over again. So next, we've got our top piece. And just like the ones I threw, they're about the same size. However, I'm going to cut on this guy, and it's going to get a little narrower. And if we back up just a little tiny bit from the piece, it does have a waistline, but it's not nearly as dramatic as this finished one where it goes in almost horizontally and then comes up. And so we're going to achieve that through making some darts. So I'm going to put the darts in between my indentations, so they'll end up going here, rather than I have tried putting them here, and it's just too much all going on in the same place. So I'm going to utilize this kind of empty space in between. And lucky for me, it's going to happen directly over that little pullout that we made at the bottom. So I'll give myself some little guide marks. I'm doing with this with the back of the knife. Not that it would really matter on this, because I'm going to cut so far down into the piece that that little nick is going to go away. But I'm going to make a slice. And I'll go down about an inch or so and cut out kind of this long skinny V. Oh, I threw that in my water bucket instead of my reclaim bucket. Oops. And I'm doing this as a continuous cut rather than cutting down, because where the knife crosses over itself would be a place that this would want to split really, really easily. But by making one continuous cut, I don't have a weak spot at the bottom where I may have cut too far. Now, if I wanted to check myself, I could take the piece from this hole and stick it into one of the other holes. And if it fits, then they're about the same size. Sometimes when I do this, maybe it would sit up like that and I know that I needed to cut more, or it would sit way down in like that and say, oh, well, this one's way bigger than the other ones, and make them all match. And you could, hold a finger and make a little trace line so you know how far down to go with each one of them. But again, Martha's done this a bunch, so I usually forego doing that unless I'm designing something new, and then I might give myself those guidelines. So I'm adding a little bit of moisture, and now I'm going to thin out these two edges. So again, I'm going to take my index finger and thumb and come in and thin out each side. And mostly this is just getting rid of those hard edges because I'll leave this seam exposed. I really enjoy the way the glaze kind of pools along this line. And it just makes a different little mark on the piece. So we got to do that 3 times all the way around. And then I'm going to take these, and one is going to go to the inside and one's going to go to the outside. And we'll do that all the way around. So one on the inside, one on the outside. And I don't usually pick it up to do that. I do it on the table like this. So then we're kind of coming in that way. And now I'm going to slip and score on the inside on one side and on the outside on the other, on all 3 of these all at the same time. So we'll apply our fun joining slip. Now this joining slip is a combination of vinegar, toilet paper, and clay. And I find it works really, really well. We'll score up one side and score up the other. And these will overlap. So again, I'm not trying to hide the fact that I took these darts. I'm actually kind of celebrating these darts by leaving them exposed. I'm not trying to hide how the piece was made, but rather letting the process become the form. And then I'm overlapping and squeezing the two together. And then I'll take my brush and clean that up. So you can still see the line. And by cutting a little bit of a U shape, I kind of end up with this little point that comes up. And it kind of reminds me of shoulder pads from the 1800s, how women sort of had that thing coming off of their shoulder, which I find kind of lovely. Although I have to say, as a kid watching movies, usually the woman that had those on her outfit was usually the bad guy. It seemed like evil in points. So we've got them all attached, and then I'll clean these guys up again. And the inside is fairly smooth, but I'll run my brush up that as well, just to make sure that it's nice and even. Well, that seems good. So now we have this at the top. So then we'll move on to our top piece. And I know that this is a little bit wide now. So if I went to put this onto the pot, it would really have a lot of overlap and kind of cover up those darts that we just put in a little bit. So rather, we're going to cut a fancy line here too, because why not celebrate the seam?
And just to confirm, when you threw that, this is the bottom.
This is the bottom, so we're upside down right now. And you can tell that this was the back because this is a really sloppy edge. Again, that inside corner where my finger was, you can't get a wooden tool in there very easily to clean it up. So the outside is really clean. And of course the top where I was able to compress the rim is really clean. But that interior edge, we're gonna cut it all off so it doesn't matter. Very handily, Shimpo makes a banding wheel that is divided into thirds. So I'm gonna use those little marks to divide this into thirds. And then I'm gonna go halfway in between. So I'm actually making 6 marks all the way around this. And I'm going to do the same cut that I did on my slab on the bottom. So I'm going to do a series of points and curves. And I'll start at a point, and then I'll come down and come up to a curve, go back down, up to a point, and then a curve. Don't forget which one you're doing, Martha. And final curve, and finish at a point. Don't throw your scraps in the water bucket, put them in the reclaim bucket. So you can see we've got kind of a point and then a larger curve kind of working our way all the way around. Now this edge, once again, is super square because I just cut it with a knife. So we'll do that same trick once again. A little bit of moisture, go in with my index finger and thumb, and round this off. Josh is just telling me I've got 9 minutes to go, so, but we only have one more seam. We're almost there. Okay, so then we can check. Look at that, it fits, so that's good. So I'm going to slip and score the inside here and the outside of the bottom. So I'll do this before I take it off the banding wheel. Just to give myself a little helping hand. Well, hopefully the lack of questions means that I'm answering everything before you guys can think of it. And once again, slip and score. And I'm doing that on the outside of this. So inside of one, outside of the other. And I don't know if it really shows that much in the video. I am being fairly aggressive with my slipping and scoring to make sure that these two pieces are going to attach onto each other. And then when I put these together, I'll put the point over my little dart. And if I did my thirds right, they should line up. And then I'll put the curve over the curve. So it's kind of reversing what's happening at the bottom. I've got a point and a curve and a point. And I usually attach the points all the way around to make sure that they're locked in place. And then I'll push out from the inside and in from the outside to make sure that these two hook onto each other. And then I'm going to come in, I'm going to hold my left hand on the outside and use my right index finger to really kind of push these two into each other. You guys get a nice armpit shot for this one. So if we looked onto the inside, it looks like that. And with my brush, I can get rid of all of those scoring marks. But if we look on the inside of the finished one, you can see that joint. I haven't tried to erase it right there, but it is smooth. So there's nothing sticking out that you're going to cut yourself on or anything like that. So it's tended to, but I'm not trying to hide the fact that these are two pieces. Why would I try to hide it on the inside if I didn't hide it on the outside? But I do make sure that it is a nice tight connection because of course you don't want to leak water out this seam. That would be very bad. And then we'll use the brush here as well. Make sure that you can't see any extra scoring marks. Usually on these upward parts, I have a little extra, just like right there. But the brush is the magic eraser. It makes all of that go away. And one last little seal job. And then last, we're going to deal with the rim. So since I have altered everything on thirds, it makes sense to have the rim be in thirds as well. So I'm going to leave 3 points high and probably about 1.5 inches wide, and then cut down in between. So I gave myself guide marks all the way around. Now this time I am making a horizontal cut because I'm going to smooth this edge out, and if I cut it with a bevel, it's a lot harder to get rid of that long edge and make it disappear. So same old trick, add a little moisture, run my index finger and thumb along the edge, go back in with the sponge, make sure that it's nice and smooth. And then we'll do one little pull out here over each one of our little shoulder points. And then kind of a long swooping one in between. All right, J. David, how did I do on your watch? What did it say?
You're good. And Cynthia said, I love your process. Everything's so well thought out, down to the detail. People don't always realize why they love your form, so thanks for sharing. 7:56.
Woohoo! Look at that, a vase in an hour. That's pretty good. So onto this piece, I could add a whole bunch of other things. So I could put handles, and usually when I do, I kind of put the handle so it attaches here. So it comes off of that rounded curve, and then it almost looks like she's like pulling up her skirt, which is kind of fun. But I can also turn this into a tulip vase. So here's another finished piece where I made these kind of flute forms and added them in onto the shoulder area. And on this one, I put the handles over the dart so you could still see the dart, something like that. Sometimes I make this piece even bigger, and instead of just 3 arms for extra flowers, I might put 9, so having 3 and 3 and 3. And I also sometimes take these and make them into even larger forms, which maybe we'll walk into the office and you can see some of those, and then we'll finish up. Guys are getting a mini tour of this video, but so that same base form could grow into something there, and something like that. So from this one simple idea of stacking things together, you can stack things further. So thank you all so much for coming. I hope to see you in another workshop in the future. If you're in the Clay Art Center area, hope you'll see you in person in the spring at the show, and maybe at an in-person workshop as well. So I'm going to sign off. I don't know if there are any other closing things we need to do, but thank you all.
Thank you, Martha. I'm going to echo what everyone's saying in the chat. Thank you so, so much. And we will have a recording of this up in a few weeks. So we will see you all later. Bye.